Welcome back to Queen City Corals. I'm Graham, and today we're going to be busting the top 10 reefing myths. All right, guys, the first one is going to be that you need fancy equipment. While things like an Apex and an autodoser are definitely nice to have, they certainly are not required. And I know from personal experience, as well as the decades that people kept reef tanks before any of these fancy gadgets came into play, it's definitely possible to have a beautiful looking tank without all the highest end equipment. And while it might take a little bit more work, it is definitely worth it to have such an amazing tank. You also can get a bunch of great deals on used equipment as well without having to shell out your entire paycheck just to get an aquarium controller or a doser. And while you might not be able to control these pumps from your phone, it's definitely something that you don't always need to be messing with. And it might not even be beneficial to be messing with your flow all the time, because then your corals aren't really able to properly adapt to those conditions. All right, the next myth is definitely a big one and super important, and that is that there are more than one way to run a reef tank. There's not just one method that works and one method that you need to follow in order to have a successful tank. For instance, even here, we run several different methods for filtration and for testing that don't prevent any tank from doing worse than another, but it's just kind of what fits into that system. What I would recommend doing is finding someone whose tank you like and following that method and seeing how that works out for you for a little while, usually 3 to 6 months. If it isn't working for you, maybe try something else. See if there's something else that they're doing that you're not. There's a lot of different things that can be influential in the tank. Anything down from sunlight hitting it to a pollutant in your house. And it's important to look at these factors to really determine what may or may not be happening in your tank, whether things are going well, whether things are going poorly, and things that you've changed recently that may have caused those effects on the corals. Heading into our third myth, which is that one thing can completely change your reef tank in a positive way. Now, there are a ton of different things like elements, dosing, bacteria, but the thing is that there are so many other factors involved in this. Because of this, it's better to take a holistic approach. For instance, if they started dosing bacteria and all of a sudden they have great effects and their tank starts doing way better, well, maybe it's because their nitrates and phosphates are really high, and that bacteria simply decrease those levels into a range that the corals prefer more. So I recommend that you don't take one piece of advice and apply that automatically and assume you're gonna get great results. Now, number 4 is probably my favorite because I have an entire YouTube video about it, and that is that pH is everything. Now, you guys can check out our video on pH for a more in-depth view of the issue. However, the biggest takeaway I would say is that pH isn't going to completely change how your tank looks or grows, and I really wouldn't focus on it unless it's spiking or dropping a lot, because the biggest thing is just stability of your pH. And it's been found that other than acroporas, other corals can grow in a pH as low as 7.2. So it's really not super necessary that you keep your pH above 8, and especially at 8.3. It's really gonna be more important with SPS corals, and softies and LPS corals are gonna be mainly focused on that stability, which is gonna be a lot more important than having a high pH. If your pH spikes at 8.5 during the day, but gets as low as 7.7 during the night, you're not gonna see those benefits of running 7.8 or 8.0 all throughout that period, because those swings can really throw off the corals and make them reacclimate every single day, causing them to not be able to focus on growing and living a healthy life. And coming in at number 5 is one that I've probably heard the most, and that is that you need to wait 6 months before adding anemones. While it is definitely good to let your tank cycle and get a little bit established before you add in your anemones, I recommend adding anemones as one of your first animals. And that's because they oftentimes will move around. And so if you have a bunch of corals glued down, they might end up walking across or even killing and stinging some of your favorite corals. So I recommend adding them early. That way they can walk around, find their spot, and then you can fill in your tank around them. So that way they don't end up killing all of your corals that you just added a few months ago. Additionally, anemones are some of the hardiest animals in the hobby, and I would say they're very similar in hardiness to beginner corals like zoanthids and mushrooms, making them a good early addition to your tank when you've only got a few corals or a few fish, and that way it makes it easier to plan out your tank. Now, number 6 is a little bit debatable, but I'll explain what I mean in a second, and that is that you need a sump. Now, obviously there are all-in-one tanks that are very successful, although the chamber in the back is kind of a mini sump, so I'm not going to count those. I think that's cheating. I will say that there are definitely reef tanks that you can run off of a canister or a hang on the back filter if you're not able to do a sump. It is, however, very important that you not only monitor things like nitrates and phosphates, because typically those other filters aren't going to be able to do enough filtration for you. It's also important to do frequent water changes and clean out your filtration media as frequently as you would do those water changes. Now, this is because those filters are less accessible, and oftentimes people can get lazy and end up not cleaning them. Especially with things like a hang on the back filter, I recommend massively oversizing it because the size ratings are usually for freshwater, which typically does not have the same level of bioload that a saltwater fish tank or reef tank will have. So it's definitely important to oversize those filters, but it's definitely not required that you have a sump. You can get things like a hang on back skimmer that'll do the job of a skimmer that you would put in the sump. And other than that, it's going to be mostly aesthetic things like having to have a heater in your tank. And you're still definitely going to be able to have a gorgeous reef tank, even if you aren't able to put a sump on it. All right, number 7 is going to be that you need to dose. Now, while dosing is definitely important and can be critical, a lot of times I have customers come in that say they've been dosing calcium and alkalinity supplements, but they don't know what their calcium and alkalinity actually are at. And this can end up doing a few things. It can end up greatly increasing one of those two elements without the other matching it, or just leading to very highly elevated levels. This can be harmful for your corals and stress them out because they're taking up a higher percent of the water volume and allowing less of the other chemicals in the water. So while dosing can be very important, it's more important to test beforehand, and a lot of people with nano tanks can even just get away with doing water changes either weekly or bi-weekly to replenish those trace elements that you're missing. All right, now number 8 might get me flamed in the comments, but is something I definitely believe and have done in a lot of my different tanks, and that is that you don't need 1 pound per gallon for your reef tank. Obviously, you can go more, and that's very beneficial because you're just gonna have more filtration. You can absolutely do with less rock. The only caveat and what makes this possible is that you need some other form of biological media in your tank, whether it's marine pure balls or any of the other porous materials that you can add into the tank that your nitrifying bacteria will grab onto and colonize. These can help replace some of the rocks if you want a lighter aquascape and one that has a little bit more space for things like corals and your fish to swim around in. All right, guys, and coming in at number 9, we're almost done. Definitely stay around for number 10. It's super exciting. But number 9 is gonna be that you can't pop bubble algae. Now, the theory has been for a very long time, I've heard this for years, that when you pop bubble algae, the water inside contains spores that will spread all throughout your tank. And it was a real mystery for a while how things like fox faces and especially emerald crabs that are popping the bubbles in order to eat and eradicate the algae are doing that without it spreading throughout your tank. But the answer is finally here. There have been some studies recently, and what it is it's actually that film around the bubble that is actually forms the bubble itself. That is what spreads the algae. So when you pop that bubble, that flesh will fly all around your tank and it'll colonize different areas and start to grow there. So while you can pop bubble algae, it's very important that you remove all the tissue of the algae to make sure that you eradicate it. All right, guys, and coming in at number 10 is that you want low or even 0 nitrates and phosphates. I've especially heard this for a while with SPS, and I will tell you from personal experience as well as hundreds of hobbyists that that is not true. For instance, in our SPS system, right now our nitrates are at 13. Our phosphates are at 0.13, which is perfect for me. Honestly, if it gets a little higher, I'm fine with that, but I have gotten nitrates as high as 50 in that system, and the coloration on my acroporas and the growth was absolutely fantastic. So that is definitely not true. What I will say is true is that you don't want one of them to get too high without the other one increasing. Obviously, there are harmful levels of nitrates where things will not do well. Even at super high levels, your fish can start to not do very well, and you'll see signs of things like sickness. But I will say that I've gotten things as high as 50 nitrates and everything is still doing fine. It's more important that you keep your nutrients balanced and at an even level. I'll also say that if you're running very high nitrates and phosphates, it's good to also have high lighting, high flow, as well as higher calcium and alkalinity, because they will need all those different nutrients in order to process them and grow. So it's not just one or another, and I recommend that you keep all your parameters fairly consistent, not only within themselves, but also together, because the main thing that a reef tank requires is stability and balance. I definitely recommend avoiding anything close to zero, because then there isn't enough nitrates and phosphates to be bioavailable for your corals. And this is something that's very important for them. And a lot of times you'll see them fading in color because they just don't have the nutrition that they need in order to continue to grow their zooxanthellae and grow their skeletons. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on our top 10 reefing myths. Let us know down in the comments below any more reefing myths that we missed, and maybe we'll do a part 2 with some of your guys' suggestions. If you guys enjoyed the video, you can leave a like down below as well. And to stay up to date with all of our latest content, make sure you guys are subscribed to our channel, and that way you get updated whenever we post our latest videos.